Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a monthly podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues, produced as a collaboration between the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa Research and Media Services. My name is Adam and I hope everyone listening is doing well. Today I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Amani's Director of Programs, Ms. Betania Tedesse. Great to see you after a while apart, Betania. How are you?
All good, Adam, and welcome back.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I've been on leave for a little while and it's good to be back. And thanks to you and Solomon for covering for me last month. And welcome to all of our listeners. As always, we try and take a few minutes in this Conversing on Africa's Peace podcast to take a look backwards at the previous month's PSC work. Thanks again to you guys for doing the podcast last month. But Tanya, just sort of briefly, I'd like to invite you to unpick some of the details for us from last month and what you took from the PSC work in April. I guess our listeners will be particularly interested right now in those early days of the current conflict in Sudan. The emergency meeting of the PSC on the 16th of April, the 20th of April ministerial special session, and the important subsequent AU communique. Those things jump out. So, yeah, welcome your thoughts on those and any other measures that you've seen from the AU and the PSC on this issue so far.
Yes, Adam, April was quite... a lot happened in April, particularly for the continent, for this region in particular. And it was also a busy month for the PSC, as you can imagine, because of the crisis that emerged in Sudan. So in addition to what was indicated in the program of work under Tunisia's chairship, there were, of course, other additional items that were added, namely the emergency session that was held on Sudan. So that is one thing that we can discuss, but another interesting session that Tunisia also tabled was an informal consultation with countries in transition, which in a way kind of relates to the case of Sudan, but also more broadly
of course,
to other countries in transitions. So when it comes to the situation in Sudan, I think there was a very quick escalation, of course, of violent confrontation between the two parties, between Sudan Armed Forces, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who's also the chairperson of the Transitional Sovereign Council, and the Rapid Support Forces, paramilitary group, again, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, who's also the deputy chairman of the Transitional Sovereign Council. So the escalation was quick, but the signs were already there.
Right.
All the early warning signs were there, but the early action was completely absent.
Yeah, it's always hard, right?
Absolutely. I think that's what made it quite difficult and really unfortunate as well, because all the mobilizations of troops from both sides were taking place, and it was very obvious that the violent escalation of conflict and confrontation was going to follow, but the actions again that were completely missed. And the violence also came after a missed deadline to also establish a civilian-led government in Sudan.
Yeah.
And also there was disagreement on security sector reform-related issues. So those things really fueled the whole confrontation between the two parties. And so following this, following the start of the fighting, the PSC held an emergency session, as you indicated earlier, on 16th of April. And it called, of course, it also released quickly a communique where it called for immediate cessation of hostilities. It also rejected the involvement of external actors, which is also very much important.
Yeah.
And also it supported the efforts of the African Union Commission Chair. He's also planned to travel to Sudan and to mediate, which at the moment remains quite impossible because of the security situation on the ground.
Sure.
What makes the current confrontation also quite dangerous is the fact that, in addition to areas like Darfur, which have been quite conflict-affected areas, now this violence is taking place in the capital city, which is a highly populated area. So it also makes it quite deadly, and it affects a large number of people.
I guess this is what's new and what's different about the conflict in Sudan this time around. Yeah.
Absolutely. And and of course, right after the violence started, of course, different kind of reactions came from different actors, but it was not, of course, able to bring any kind of immediate impact on stopping the fighting. And I think that the fear is also that the more the conflict and the fighting prolongs, the more difficult it becomes to actually stop it, and it also has the risk of inviting external actors to actually meddle in the situation and complicate the situation further.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a major risk. And also another aspect that you can also that can be highlighted is also the fact that the more, again, the fighting prolongs, the higher is the risk for the two generals also to lose control of their own troops. Because either of the group is homogeneous. Both the army and the RSF have factions within each of these groups.
Yeah,
there are different interests. So it would be very, very hard for even the two generals to have command and control on their own troops the more that the fighting also prolongs. So it is a very complex, but also very kind of situation that requires immediate kind of action. But in addition, I think, to the PSC's efforts, what the African Union Commission also did through the chairperson, the convening of the ministerial meeting, which you also indicated earlier, that also came with strong kind of recommendations and very strong kind of calls from the African Union side. And today, May 2nd, there's going to be another meeting that is going to be convened by the AU chair. So there is that engagement, at least, that is happening.
Yeah, I thought it was quite good to see the AU move so quickly, relatively speaking, and to put its position forward on the conflict. And we'll wait with interest to see how today's extra meeting goes. Obviously, we're recording this early in the month.
Yeah.
Early and direct attention on the conflict in Sudan, sort of from mid-April onwards, and that continues into the month of May, where, as our listeners may know, Uganda is scheduled to take the chair for the month. To our knowledge, we envisage 5 thematic and 2 country-specific sessions, as well as a couple of other really interesting events early in the month, one of which is underway at the moment. And I guess, noting the ongoing situation in Sudan, there may be another ad hoc discussion or some kind of session. That remains to be seen as the situation evolves and the various mediation efforts continue. But first of all, the AU Peace and Security Council is due to meet its EU counterpart in Brussels on the 2nd and 3rd of May for its 14th annual consultative meeting. And this is a forum to discuss cooperation on important thematic issues between the two institutions, and to sort of develop strategies for more fully addressing conflicts and crises as they arise, and to discuss strategies for their resolution. My understanding from your analysis and our discussion is that the situations in the Great Lakes, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, amongst others, will be discussed. And I imagine maybe the conflict in Sudan will be, bumped up the agenda somewhat as well. But I know there's other things like DRC, the situation in East DRC, etc., will be discussed. So what's your sense of how those consultations will play out and what we might expect to hear from them?
So yes, the PSC is set to meet its counterpart in the EU in Brussels this time around. So it has the meeting has 2 components. There is an informal kind of consultation, but also the annual consultative meeting, which is scheduled for the 3rd of May. Right. The one taking place today on the 2nd of May is more of an informal kind of meeting between the two, the council and the committee. And it has 2 broad agendas, one on multilateralism, and the other one on peace support operations in Africa. So both timely issues that should be discussed, given how there is a huge debate coming around how inclusive and effective the multilateral system is at the moment.
Absolutely.
And when it comes to the AU-led or the African Union peace support operations, that is also a timely topic, timely policy issue. Particularly speaking both from the African Union side, not just the financing bit, but also in terms of taking stock of what the experience has been for the African Union deploying peace support operations, which a lessons learned exercise has been undertaken last year in Abuja. So also to reflect on the lessons, but also how to use those lessons to better respond to peace and security issues in the continent in the future. So having this discussion again with partners like the European Union also it's very interesting, and it's also very useful for the PSC as well, for the African Union to engage on this matter with partners. Also given the current context, if you see, particularly when it comes to the funding of ATMIS, the European Union has been a major donor for that particular peace support operation in Somalia. So there are a lot of convergence, there are a lot of policy convergence between these two bodies. So these topics are quite pertinent at the moment. So the regional aspect will come on the second day, particularly on the Sahel, the Great Lakes region in the Horn of Africa. Within that context, I think definitely there are certain crisis and conflict situations that will receive a lot of attention. Particularly when it comes to the Horn of Africa, of course, definitely the case of Sudan, but also Somalia, as I mentioned, it's something of interest for both institutions. And the situation of Sudan as well. I think what the African Union is doing at the moment, particularly through the office of the chairperson, is one thing that became very clear is that the African Union is trying to bring a bit of coordination of the international efforts, and that is something that came out very clearly from the different sessions, from the ministerial session, but also from the PSCs, that there needs to be a bit of coherence on the response on the crisis in in Sudan. So it's really important then to engage partners on these issues, for the AU to also clearly state its position, where it stands, and to also play that leadership role when it comes to responding to what is happening currently in Sudan. So clearly, the Horn of Africa has been also one of the regions that received a lot of attention in the PSC for quite some time. But the other regions, particularly the Sahel, of course, issues related to terrorism, but also complex political transitions that are affecting a lot of countries within the region, is definitely going to be discussed. Yeah.
Do we expect like a communique, or what's the concrete kind of output from these informal and formal meetings?
Usually there's the annual consultative meeting. There is a joint communique that comes from both institutions. But last year there was a disagreement between these two bodies, particularly with regards to reference to the war in Ukraine, and the PSC really felt that was beyond its mandate. So there was a bit of disagreement on that issue. So the whole communique did not.
That's right. That rings a bell. Year. Yeah.
But before that, things were smoother a bit.
Yeah.
There were joint communiques that were released on a number of this.
So all things being well, we can expect a joint communique this time around. Well, look, that's really interesting and very timely, as you say, and I guess we wish the two PSCs well in their deliberations at this critical juncture in sort of African peace and security affairs. And we look forward to that readout of the outcomes. Then there's a couple of days break while people wrap up in Brussels, I guess, and get themselves back to Addis. And the next meeting is on the 11th of May. When we will see this interesting institution or group, the Panel of the Wise, briefing on its mission to Chad. What do you anticipate to be the key issues or points of discussion for that session?
So the main purpose that the panel of the wise was the PSC decided to deploy the panel of the wise in Chad was also to receive a bit of guidance from after like a field mission and based on information that comes from the ground. So the idea is to get a feedback and also guidance from the panel of the wise regarding the situation in Chad. And as you may recall, I think that the situation in Chad and the PSC's response towards Chad has been a bit complex. Mm-hmm. It was not necessarily straightforward, given the kind of developments that were taking place in the country. And last year, in November, under Namibia's chairship, the PSC was able to at least decide to have a field mission or fact-finding mission to be conducted by the panel of the wise. So one important, of course, improvement is also for the panel of the wise to be revived in such a way to contribute into such a process.
Yep.
To also provide a bit of guidance for the PSC on how to engage the situation. Despite the kind of decision that was taken by the transitional authority in Chad, which were all kind of against the parameters set by the PSC, it really requires a bit of reflection on how now to engage the transitional authorities, because there were a number of violations of all the set kind of timelines in terms of the transitional period.
Right.
And the kind of requirements in electoral processes, and all those things seem to be compromised. And it's so important for the PSC to also rely on the panel of the wise for its guidance also on how to further engage the authorities in Chad.
Okay, very good. Understood. The next session is really interesting. The following day, there's going to be a virtual ministerial meeting on financing of AU peace and security operations. Lots of discussion on this kind of pretty hot topic for a long period of time here in Addis Ababa and quite frequently and indeed very recently in New York around the realisation of UN resolutions, what are they, 2320 and 2378, I think, in relation to regional organisations and peacekeeping and so on. I know UNSG Guterres has recently released a report that touches on these issues. I admit I haven't read that report yet. Maybe you have, Betania, but tell us about this virtual ministerial meeting and what will be discussed and what outcomes we might anticipate.
Yes, so this meeting is also, I think, it addresses one of those topics that everyone is talking about, the financing of AU support operations. Yeah. There is a big momentum that is being generated after the adoption of the consensus paper that was developed by the African Union on financing during its 36th summit. But in addition to that, I think that the kind of expectation there was around the Secretary General's report, which was released end of April, a few days back. And what is interesting about the report is that in terms of documenting what worked in the past and what did not work. So there is a lot of lesson learning exercise that I've seen in the report. So that is really good, so that we don't repeat the same kind of mistakes that happened in the past, so that we can really move forward in providing sustainable and predictable funding for peace support operations in the continent. And particularly, I think it also offers practical kind of recommendations on how to move forward, including setting specific recommendations, building on previous discussions, but also building on some of the suggestions that also came from the African Union side as well.
Right.
So in terms of the modality of the financing part, I think that the two recommendations were particularly pushed in the report. One is the establishment of a hybrid, for example, a hybrid mission, similar to one that was deployed in Darfur, the UNAMID one, so that to have predictable financing and to have access to UN assessed contribution. The second one, which is also something that the African Union has also been, which the AU has also expressed a lot of interest is the kind of the model that has been used in Somalia to support AMISOM and now ATMIS,
Right.
like a support package provided by the UN. So these are like the kind of two recommendations that the ASG also provides. And also these are the way forward in terms of getting a bit of support from the Security Council members as well, because within the Security Council that the composition also really matters, and there are some that support this and others that do not necessarily feel like now is the right time for this kind of support. But definitely there is a change in the environment in the UN Security Council.
Right.
There's much more conducive environment, so
Yes.
it's a good and there is the foundation that has been now built by the consensus paper, and now we have the SG report and the kind of work that is also expected from the African three members.
Yep.
It's a lot, of course. But I think there are others that support this cause, this African cause within the UN Security Council. And this month, actually, Switzerland, based on the request from the A3, will also have a briefing session, particularly on this report. So there is support that is coming from various members of the UN Security Council. So that is also very refreshing to see.
It'd be interesting to see if there is enough positive momentum. I agree that it feels like the tide might be turning in that direction. Let's just hope that, fair minds prevail and there's a little bit of give and take so that, collectively, UN, AU, other interested parties can all kind of find a way forward so that...
I think one important aspect, like going back to the PSC, this ministerial meeting again, is the fact that what this ministerial meeting is also, like what it would be good to come out from this ministerial meeting, like it's happening at the ministerial level, it's happening at the high level. So it's also to give much more political support and much more kind of push from the PSC, and one thing that was somehow not strong in the past, for example, has been the communication between PSC and A3 when it comes to this negotiation of resolution. So this time around, enhancing that communication between the PSC and the A3 within the UN Security Council remains really critical for the success of this resolution.
Okay, I think we'll sort of come back to one or two of those issues a little bit later on, but moving on for the sake of time to the 16th of May, very briefly, tell us a little bit more about the African First Ladies Peace Mission, which will be discussed at the PSC level on the 16th of May.
So this kind of briefing, I mean, it's not very common within the PSC, but this time around, the PSC will be receiving a bit of updates on the various mediation and preventive diplomacy engagements by the African First Ladies.
Okay.
But also it aims at exchanging a bit of best practices and also for the PSC to provide a bit of feedback on that. One development, like recently at the margins of the 36th AU Summit, actually the summit, the Assembly of Organization of African First Ladies convened under the theme Closing Gaps in Gender Equity. So it would be very interesting to have that particular dimension of peace and security efforts when it comes to gender issues, gender mainstreaming, and women's participation. So it's really will give a lot of weight in this regard.
Okay. It sounds like an interesting session, and it coincides with what I understand to be a kind of press release or a note drawing attention by the Peace and Security Council to the International Day of Living Together in Peace. Very briefly, tell us a little bit about the origins of the day or what it's supposed to be about.
Usually, for this one, the PSC used to hold actually sessions, open sessions sometimes to really commemorate this International Day of Living Together. But also it's about, really emphasizing the values of peace, reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, all those values. So in the past, the PSC held a number of sessions on the issue, but this year around it really opted to commemorate the day with the press release.
Okay, fair enough. Moving on to the 17th of May, the annual open session of the PSC on the humanitarian situation in Africa. Obviously, a number of protracted crises, new crises that we could point to. And I understand that for this open session, growing concerns around food security and the way to scale up responses during crises are likely to be sort of key areas of interest.
Yes, so this focus on food security and the nexus between food security and conflict in Africa. Even last year, we had a similar kind of agenda item under Cameroon's chairship. And it's also very interesting because that was also for the first time for the PSC to also engage on that particular theme between the nexus of food insecurity and conflict situations.
Because it's had so much attention since, it feels like, right?
Absolutely. Because also the kind of trend we see in different conflict scenarios and how starvation is also being used increasingly as a weapon of conflict in many instances. So there is a very grave concern around that, but what the Ugandan chairship is also trying to bring in this session, like a different dimension, is also how the continent is really able to meet food, to have that the continent does not necessarily have to rely on aid. It actually can sustain itself through production. It has all the resources, it has all the available kind of resources to really have that independence when it comes to food production. But it's also, it will also be good to have that dimension well reflected, despite the available resources, despite what the continent possesses.
I think it's a great point. The resources are there. It's just where they end up and how they're moved and how they're distributed and who does what with them when.
Exactly.
The resources are there a lot of the time.
They're utilized or not. So it would be good to have that aspect reflected as well. So it's good to have a follow-up for the PSC as well on this thematic issue.
Okay, so we're moving through May at pace. Next up, the PSC Committee of Experts retreat goes for a few days, sort of 18 to 22 May. 3 main issues under discussion is my understanding. The establishment or the definition perhaps of a sanctions committee to examine and deliberate on that quite important and topical issue. African Union counter-terrorism efforts and discussion of ways to improve working methods. As we said sort of before, between the AUPSC and the A3 of the UN Security Council. Do you have anything else to say on that issue or any of those other ones that I mentioned in relation to the retreat?
So the ones in relation to the sanctions and the ones on the counterterrorism, which is the idea of developing TORs for both of these bodies to have specific subcommittee on sanctions, but also ministerial committee on counterterrorism. This also is a result of the discussion that was held in Malabo. Like a lot of it's also based on the decision that came from Malabo on UCG and terrorism. So it's a way of having establishing mechanisms to have this renewed kind of response towards terrorism and UCG. And again, the last one, the relationship between the AUPSC and A3, I think that's also an area that requires a bit of work in terms of making it much more systematic and much more strategic. Also to ensure that there is a timely kind of information sharing that is coming from both sides on areas that are of interest for both the African Union and the UN. So really the A3 are really the bridge between the two councils, and it's really important that they receive the necessary backing from the Addis side, but also for them to also inform of the developments in New York to the stakeholders in Addis. So having that relationship, building that relationship will also have a lot of benefits in the partnership aspects.
Okay. Sounds like an interesting retreat. And again, we can't wait to hear what happens there from participants and via other channels. So we wish them all well. The sixth session for the month will be focused on ATMOS, its achievements so far and its mandate, and I guess plans for the future. Any reflections on that agenda item, Britannia?
So the issue of ATMIS has been a recurring one.
Sure.
In every program of month that is currently being developed by the PSC. Of course, ATMIS features, and
Right.
for very good reasons. So this particular session will also receive kind of briefing from the troop contributing countries head of states meeting that was held in Kampala under Uganda's leadership, of course, on specifically on ATMIS and the current process around drawdown and the procedures related to that and the implication of that. Particularly, there is a deadline that is approaching end of June now, the drawdown of the 2,000 troops from ATMIS. So to have a bit of understanding on that process, the session was convened, the summit level of TCCs. So to have also for the different TCCs to be also on the same page on what the procedure looks like of drawdown. So that one has already been completed, so it would be good for to have a bit of briefing on the major outcomes for the PSC as well. But in addition to that, of course, beyond the drawdown, the immediate drawdown, there is of course another planned drawdown, the 3,000 troops coming again in September. So the idea is to finalize everything by the end of December 2024 for the final exit of ATMIS. But there are a lot of discussions happening, particularly when it comes to the financing bit aspect as well. At the moment, there is a huge deficit. There is a huge financial kind of gap that exists, which will definitely, of course, it impacts, of course, the operations of the mission as well. So the African Union is also trying to mobilize as much support as possible when it comes to providing support to this transition, because it's a very limited time, and there needs to be a lot of support in that window, and that opportunity has to be utilized so that there is somehow a smooth kind of transition from ATMIS to the national security forces in Somalia. So there has been, of course, efforts, like I mentioned, in mobilizing funding. Also because major donors have also, there are some cuts on financial support for major donors that supported ATMIS in the past, AMISOM as well in the past. So that will definitely have implications on the transition process.
Yeah, complex and costly. By the sounds of things, thank you for that insight, Britannia. The original agenda for the month of May had a PSC field trip to Sudan scheduled for sort of towards the end of the month, 24 to 26 May. Extremely unlikely to go ahead, just not feasible under current circumstances. So I guess, those last few days of May may be an opportunity to call another ad hoc session or on Sudan or something else. I mean, I guess it's a bit of watch this space at the moment would be sort of my naive assessment of what we might expect sort of towards the end of May. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Yes, I mean, this one, of course, given the situation, it's really highly unlikely. But, if we're talking about any PSC session on Sudan, it might also come a bit earlier. Like, we don't know, how things will evolve.
I guess they always reserve the right to throw the agenda out the window and do something that they feel is more important on any given day, right?
Absolutely. I mean, because what also requires is a bit flexibility of the crisis now in Sudan. It requires that amount of flexibility. So we'll see.
Well, as we've said, it's early May at time of recording, and as of today, the situation in Sudan remains extremely fluid and volatile, and of course, we hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict as soon as possible to avoid, further death, destruction and suffering. And clearly, we appreciate all the efforts of the various parties to make that happen. We should just wish Uganda all the very best as it chairs the PSC for May, and we wish everyone taking part in the work of the PSC fruitful deliberations on the important topics outlined briefly here today. We hope the podcast continues to provide an accessible way to understand the PSC and its work. Britannia, thanks again for joining me today and for sharing your insights with us. also want to personally congratulate Amani. I wasn't here to celebrate with you your 5th anniversary last month. It looks like you had a couple of great events and well-deserved praise and honour from the AU kind of watcher community here in Addis. So thanks to you and your colleagues for your contribution to that scene, if you want to call it that, here in Addis. So yeah, well done, and give our regards to Solomon, Dr. Solomon, busy as ever, and I look forward to talking to you again next month. Before I sign off, we always do our little highlighting of African states with national celebrations in May. So we have Cameroon on the 20th of May, Eritrea on the 24th of May, Ethiopia on the 24th of May. Apologies if I've missed any, but to those countries and their people, we wish you all peace and prosperity.
Thank you so much, Adam, again for this very interesting podcast. And thank you also for joining us, for our listeners, for this month, Conversing on Africa's Peace podcast, the collaboration between Amani Africa and the Australian Embassy in Addis. We hope you have a great month, and we'll be back next month to consider the PSC's agenda for the month of June. Thank you.